G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Isaiah. This is a study that has been taken from Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum's commentary on the book of Isaiah. Dr. Fruchtenbaum is the founder of RL Ministries. So we're now into session 23 of the book of Isaiah. Thank you all for coming along. Just recap quickly where we finished off last session. We see we're in the section now where we're going to see the deliverance by Cyrus the Great. Remember, Isaiah is living 150 years before Cyrus even comes on the scene, and he prophesies of this coming deliverer. And we learned last time that Jehovah is Israel's redeemer. Jehovah was the one who formed Israel from the womb, and he will provide this deliverance from the future Babylonian captivity. Now, God has compared himself with the false idols and false prophets to show that idolatry, and especially Babylonian idolatry, because that's what we're heading into, is totally incapable of prophesying and predicting anything. However, Jehovah is one who is going to predict everything in minute detail. Moreover, what he predicts will come to pass, not like the Babylonian diviners. This he does through Isaiah, his servant Isaiah, and through the other prophets. Now remember, well, not remember, but while the prophets of the Babylonian deities and the gods are frustrated because their prophecies do not come to pass, in the case of Jehovah's prophets, God is their confirmer, because what he speaks through these prophets, that always comes to pass. And he prophesies the return from Babylon. Remember, they're not even in Babylon yet, but he's already prophesying that they're going to go into captivity and they're going to be returned and they're going to be let loose by a man called Cyrus. So he's going to remove all obstacles standing in the way of their return. Nothing's going to hinder their return. It's going to happen. God is the one now who names the coming deliverer, and as I said, his name is Cyrus. Again, remember, Cyrus lived 150 years after Isaiah made this prophecy. Yet God is able to be so specific in his predictions that he's actually able to name the Persian monarch leader who will bring to an end the Babylonian Empire. And this is going to give the Jews the right to return to the land. Now, God actually called Cyrus his shepherd. He says, my shepherd. Now, why? Because he's going to perform shepherd duties for Israel. And he'll not only give them the right to return to Israel, but he'll also provide for them to return. Now, God has ordained and decreed Cyrus to carry out two things, and that is concerning Jerusalem, she will be rebuilt, and secondly, concerning the temple, the foundations are going to be laid. Now, moving into chapter 45, the message continues. This time, the Lord is going to speak directly to Cyrus. In first part of this is we're going to look at 45 verses 1 to 7. Now, in verse 1, second part of verse 1, thus says Jehovah to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him. So God now speaks directly to Cyrus, and he calls him my anointed or my Messiah. The Hebrew term for anointed here is Mashiach or Messiah. Now, while the true Messiah will bring spiritual and physical deliverance to Israel, Cyrus is a type of that true Messiah, in that he will bring physical deliverance to Israel in the land of Babylon. And then we're going to go on and see now, in verses, second part of verse 1 to verse 3, he's going to describe God's work on behalf of Cyrus. Now, 3 points are made now concerning God's work on behalf of Cyrus. First of all, and I will loose the loins of kings to open the doors before him, and the gates shall not be shut. What he's saying here is that God is going to make the way smooth. He's going to smooth the way for victory for Cyrus. And because God supports Cyrus, Isaiah says he'll be able to gain victory easily, and nations will be subjected before him, and what was seemingly impregnable cities will be taken by him. Now, many records from the time of Cyrus attest to this fact. When Cyrus began to conquer, he took impregnable cities with ease. Impregnable cities like Sardis fell with ease, though other kings had tried and failed, but he conquered it easily. And we see the second thing in verse 2, Cyrus will conquer Babylon. I will go before you, God speaking, I'll go before you and make the rough places smooth. I will break in pieces the doors of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. Now this describes the victory here that Cyrus will have over Babylon. Now, he speaks of the doors of brass and the bars of iron. Now, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, there were 100 brass gates in the walls surrounding Babylon, and yet none of these heavy brass gates nor any bars of iron would stop the conquest by Cyrus. So in verse 2, God now says, I will give you Babylon as part of your conquest. The third thing we see in first part of verse 3, and I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hidden reaches of secret places. Yeah, this is a reference to wealth that has been hidden from the public eye. And this is a promise here of victory over a king called Croesus, Croesus, King Croesus, it's on the screen there, and the Lydian Empire. One thing Croesus was famous for was his wealth. Croesus had his headquarters in the city of Sardis. He was a very wealthy king, and he hid his wealth in subterranean tunnels. And these tunnels were secret and dark places, yet God knew where it was all hidden. And Cyrus was able to conquer this country of Lydia with ease, and all the fabulous wealth of Lydia and its king Croesus went into the pockets of Cyrus the Great. So in verse 2, he's promised victory over Babylon. In verse 3, he's promised victory over Lydia. And these were the two major empires that Cyrus conquered, the Babylonian and the Lydian Empire, and this then allowed him to establish the Persian Empire. The second part of verse 3 to verse 6, we now provide three reasons why God will use Cyrus for this occasion. First of all, we see that Cyrus may know the Lord. It says in verse 3b, that you may know that it is I, Jehovah, who call you by your name, even the God of Israel. So the God of Israel gave the great Gentile monarch Cyrus, whose reign coincided with the latter days of Daniel's life, the opportunity to know him. Cyrus did recognize to some extent that the God of Israel was aiding him. However, he did not know this to be to the saving extent, because all he did was he simply included Jehovah among other gods. He gave Jehovah credit for victory. He also gave Marduk, the god of Babylon, credit. Therefore, while Cyrus to an extent did recognize the work of Jehovah, he did not make him the only God. He simply made him a chief god among many other gods. Therefore, while Cyrus had the opportunity to come to know the Lord, he did not take it. Second reason why God will use Cyrus for Israel's sake, in verse 4. For Jacob my servant's sake and Israel my chosen, I have called you by your name. I have surnamed you, though you have not known me. So because of God's covenantal relationship with Israel, and because God promised that the Babylonian captivity would end after 70 years, through Cyrus he intends to bring this captivity to an end. And for this reason, God calls Cyrus by name, even though the king never truly knew him. And the third reason we see, it's so that all nations may know the Lord. This is in verses 5 to 6. I am Jehovah, and there is none else. Besides me there is no God. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. I am Jehovah, and there is none else. So in verse 5, what we see here is the Lord's uniqueness being pointed out. There is none besides him. In verse 6 is the key purpose that all nations eventually may know the uniqueness of God. Now Cyrus never understood that there is no other God but Jehovah. He never recognized that it was this God who guided or who girded or equipped him. Yet the nations would understand God's uniqueness, because in the days of Cyrus, this never happened. Therefore, the question arises now of how Cyrus was used for the accomplishment of this third purpose, that the nations would know God. The answer is found in the subsequent history of the Jewish people. God used Cyrus the Great to end the Babylonian captivity and bring his people back to their land. This was a prerequisite for the birth of the Messiah. According to prophecy, he had to be born in the land of Israel, and he was born in Bethlehem. This is Messiah. And before his ascension, Messiah promised to return, and at his second coming, all nations will come to know the God of Israel. And so this is the sense in which God used Cyrus to accomplish the third goal, namely that all nations would recognize his uniqueness. And then in verse 7, it says, this is God speaking, he says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I am Jehovah that does all these things. Now, what we see here is, what we realize here is that God is actually speaking against the very religious beliefs of Persia of which Cyrus was a part. The information on Persian religious beliefs is very limited. However, the historical existence of the ancient Persian spiritual leader Zarathustra is frequently recorded by classical sources. Now, Zarathustra is also known as Zoroaster, and the religious belief that was founded on his teaching is known as Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is the religion of dualism. What it says is, it says that there are two independent forces. There's a God of light and peace, and there's a God of darkness and calamity. Moreover, what they see is this dualism of a conflict between good and evil. So it has an eschatology that predicts the ultimate conquest of evil by good. So again, we see in verse 7, Jehovah speaks against this dualism that he is God above. He says, I form the light and create darkness. He says, I make peace and create evil. He's speaking directly to this Zoroastrianism. And he says, I am Jehovah that does all these things. So in verse 7, God speaks against the very religion of which Cyrus is a part, Zoroastrianism, dualism. And in addition, God says, I am God, I have no competition. I've got nobody else besides me. There is no dualism in him. And whatever the Persian may have seen as the dualism of peace and evil, Jehovah is the God of both. Now, having given this prophecy in verses 1 to 7, Isaiah breaks out into a song of praise in verse 8. Distill ye the heavens from above, and let the skies pour down righteousness. Let the earth open that it may bring forth salvation, and let it cause righteousness to spring up together. I, Jehovah, have created it. When heaven rains righteousness, salvation results in the earth. Salvation in the earth yields righteousness in the earth. Now, in both cases, Isaiah says, it is a work of God. I, Jehovah, have created it. Verse 8 is actually a prayer by Isaiah. It is actually interrupting the flow of the prophecy. Isaiah says that the prophecies of chapter 44, verse 24 to 45, verse 7 might begin the process of fulfillment. That's what he's praying for here. Now, we're going to see the rebuke of critics in verses 9 to 13. Isaiah's song of praise is followed by a rebuke of God's critics, which we see in 9 to 13. The criticism of God is that he would use a Gentile monarch, a pagan Gentile idolater like Cyrus, as a means of accomplishing his plan. God has announced that he will accomplish his plan by means of a Gentile idolater. Therefore, he's being criticized by some fundamentalists of the day that this is a no-no. Can't do this, God. and God is being criticized for using Cyrus. And so we see a rebuke of these critics here in verses 9 to 13. 2 points are made. First of all, the absurdity of the critics themselves is made in verses 9 to 10. Woe unto him that strives with his maker, a potsherd among the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioned it, what made you? Or your work, he has no hands. Woe unto him that saith unto a father, what begets you? Or to a woman, with what travails you? The point of these verses here is the absurdities of the critics and their criticism. It's like clay talking back to the potter. Clay never does that. It would be absurd for clay to speak back to the potter. Also, we see in verse 10, it's like a fetus in the womb speaking and demanding answers to what is happening. Fetuses in the womb do not do that. They might do that after they're born, but certainly not while they're in the womb. It is totally absurd. And that is how God pictures these critics. God is the creator of the whole world. He is in total control. He knows best how to work out his own plan and purpose. Moreover, who are these critics that criticize the way he's going to work this plan out regarding Israel and the Babylonian captivity? Who are they? And second, we see now that he defends his sovereignty to do as he wishes in verses 11 to 13. Thus says Jehovah, the Holy One of Israel and his Maker, ask me of the things that are to come concerning my sons and concerning the work of my hands. Command ye me. I have made the earth and created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens, and all their host have I commanded. Verse 13, I have raised him up in righteousness, and I will make straight all his ways. He shall build my city, and he shall let my exiles go free, not for price nor reward, saith Jehovah of hosts. So here in verse 11, God points out that no man can command God as to how he should accomplish his plan. It is God's program. It is God's work. No mortal, finite man can command an immortal, infinite God as to how things should be accomplished and how the plan should work its way out. Also in verse 12, God is the creator of all that exists in the heavens and the earth. And as the creator of everything, he can do with it as he chooses. In verse 13, he reaffirms, he reiterates, and he restates his purpose and plan in Cyrus. Cyrus will be raised up to accomplish the program of righteousness. Now, we know Cyrus was not himself righteous. However, God's program was righteous. And part of carrying out the righteous program included using Cyrus for this specific purpose. God makes points concerning Cyrus. First of all, he says, I will raise him up in righteousness. Second, I will straight his ways and I'll ease his conquest. Third, he will rebuild Jerusalem in the sense that he would grant a decree to allow the city to be rebuilt. And fourth, he will let the exiles go free. And fifth, Cyrus will not do this for any type of ransom or reward. So in verses 11 to 13, God defended his sovereignty against the critics. It is his creation. He will do with it as he pleases. And we see now the submission of the Gentiles to Israel in verses 14 to 17. In these verses, he deals with a much more distant prophecy. This prophecy is the submission of the Gentiles to Israel. It does not deal with 150 years into the future, but many, many centuries into the future. Verse 14, thus says Jehovah, the labor of Egypt, and the merchandise of Ethiopia, and the Sabaeans, men of stature, shall come over unto you, and they shall be yours. They shall go after you. In chains they shall come over, and they shall fall down unto you. They shall make supplication unto you, saying, surely God is in you, and there is none else. There is no God. Verily you are a God that hides yourself, O God of Israel, the Saviour. Verse 14 describes the submission of three nations. First Egypt, then Ethiopia, and the Sabaeans. The Sabaeans were a tribe in Upper Egypt, located between Egypt and Ethiopia. He's essentially dealing here with the northeast countries of Africa. Now, these are the very enemies of Israel today. Yet one day, they will submit themselves to Israel. They will submit themselves as slaves. They'll come because of the last phrase of verse 14, because they will recognize that God is with the people of Israel and not outside the people of Israel. And so, this is a summary statement of chapter 19, which details the submission of the people of Egypt to the people of Israel. It's also a summation of chapters 18 and 20, which deal with the submission of the people of Ethiopia to Israel. Therefore, what we see in verse 14, ultimately, the enemies of Israel will all submit themselves to Israel because of the recognition of Jehovah being with his people. Now, once again, when Isaiah sees this prophecy, he breaks out into song in verse 15. Verily you are a God that hides yourself, O God of Israel, the Saviour. Now, when he says that God hides himself, it does not mean that God is being secret. The word hiding himself means, in the sense of his program, is that it is incomprehensible. In other words, he is given all this revelation of God's program. So he breaks it in verse 15 with a song that his ways and program are incomprehensible. No other God, no phony prophet would come up with such a fantastic plan. Now, if we were to actually turn to Romans 11, verse 33 to 36, Romans 11, 33 to 36, we see the same kind of spirit in the writings of Paul. Like the section we're dealing with in Isaiah, Romans chapter 9 to 11 deals with God's program with Israel. Now, much of Paul's writings in chapters 9 to 11 of Romans contain its seed thoughts in Isaiah. In fact, Paul quotes Isaiah heavily throughout this section. In chapter 9, he points at the fact that Israel's unbelief in her Messiah did not take God by surprise. Rather, in chapter 9, this was all part of God's program. God had planned for Israel to reject her Messiah. Why did he do that? So that in chapter 10, opportunity might be given to the Gentiles to become a saving knowledge of the God of Israel. Also, in the beginning of chapter 11 of Romans, in verses 1 to 10, he makes the point that not all Jews have rejected the Messiah. Nevertheless, throughout this present dispensation, there will be a remnant of Jews who will believe in Jesus Christ. And we see that in Romans 11, 11 to 15. Now, Romans 11, 16 to 24, Paul spells out ultimately God's program for Israel will be accomplished. For the day is coming when all Israel will be saved. Every Jew will be saved without exception. This is we see in Romans 11, 25 to 32. As Paul was able to give all this revelation concerning God's program for Israel, he also broke out into a song. And in Romans 11, 33 to 36, it's Paul's song of praise. Oh, the depths of the rich. This is Romans 11, 33 to 36. Oh, the depths of the riches of both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past tracing out. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has first given to him, and it shall be recompensed unto him again? For of him and through him and unto him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. You see, the spirit that Paul presents in Romans 11, 33 to 36 is the same spirit that Isaiah presents in 45:15. God's ways are thoroughly unsearchable. It is a plan that is so magnificent, it is God's plan. In that way, his program is hidden. It is hidden in that man on his own cannot find out the program of God. It must come by revelation. Now, Isaiah concluded verse 15 by addressing the God of Israel and calling him Savior. All that the prophets wrote reveal God's program for Israel's salvation. In verse 16 of Isaiah, at that time, when the Gentiles submit to Israel, they'll become very much ashamed of the idols that they trusted. Verse 16 says, they shall be put to shame, yes, confounded, all of them. They shall go into confusion together that are makers of idols. As for Israel in verse 17, that will not be the case, but Israel shall be saved by Jehovah with an everlasting salvation. Ye shall not be put to shame nor confounded, world without end. Rather, Israel that was once prone to worship Babylonian idols will do so no more. Israel shall be saved by Jehovah with an everlasting salvation. Nevertheless, as for Israel, she'll not be shamed or confused as the Gentiles who worship the idols. Now, God introduced his message to Israel, covered in verses 18 to 21, with another reminder of who he is. And this is the message of salvation to Israel. In verse 18, for thus said Jehovah that created the heavens, the God that formed the earth and made it, that established it and created it, not a waste, that formed it to be inhabited. I am Jehovah, and there is none else. Again, see how the Lord affirmed that he created the heavens, and there is no other God beside him. He alone is creator. Notice in verse 18, though, he says The God that formed the earth created it not a waste. Now, what does that tell you about Genesis chapter 1, verse 2? Genesis 1, verse 2, Genesis 1, verse 1 says that God created the heavens and the earth. We know that. Verse 2 then says, and the earth was waste and void. However, what we're seeing here in verse 17 of Isaiah 45, verse 17 says that when God created the earth, it was not waste. But Genesis 1:2 says it was waste. Okay, why? What happened between Genesis 1 verses 1 and 2? It means that it became a waste for some reason. So therefore, there's a gap of time, nobody knows how long, between Genesis 1 verse 1 and 2. During that gap, something occurred which caused the earth to become a waste. Something occurred that caused the earth to become covered with water. Now remember, the water was a judgment. The oceans, by the way, are part of God's judgment. The oceans that covered the earth entirely in Genesis 1 were a result of judgment. And that is why in the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation 21 and 22, there will be no oceans, none whatsoever. So that means that there will be no crayfish. Ezekiel 28, verse 11 to 19, Ezekiel 28, 11 to 19, tells us what the earth looked like when it was first created. There were no oceans. The earth was one globe, a mineral garden of precious stones. All kinds of precious stones were on the surface of the earth. It was a shining splendor. Satan, before his fall, walked amidst these stones of fire, which was the earth when it was first created. However, when Satan fell and God judged Satan, he also judged everything under Satan's authority. And the beautiful mineral earth was now covered with water and became a waste. To this day, that judgment has not been thoroughly alleviated. God allowed some dry land to appear. Nevertheless, most of the earth's surface today is still covered by the judgment of oceans. And that judgment of oceans will not be completely removed until the new heavens and the new earth are created. So verse 18 gives a clue to what occurred. Something took place which caused the earth to be covered with water. And Ezekiel 28 tells us what? It was the fall of Satan. In verse 19, I have not spoken in secret in a place of the land of darkness. I said not unto the seed of Jacob, seek ye me in vain. I, Jehovah, speak righteousness. I declare things that are right. So here we see that God is the revealer. He says God has not spoken in secret because everything which has happened has been prophesied by the prophets. God has not spoken from a place of darkness, which happens to be the case of the occult worshippers of Babylon. When the Babylonian prophets speak, they are in contact with the forces of darkness and the world of darkness. Also, he says here, he never told Israel in vain to seek him, because if Israel will seek the revelation of God, she will find righteousness, truth, and salvation. It is not in vain that the seed of Jacob should seek the revelation of God. For in that revelation they'll find the righteousness and truth that they're after. On the other hand, in verse 20, there is a total futility in going after idols. Verse 20 says, assemble yourselves and come, draw near together, you that are escaped of the nations. They have no knowledge that carry the wood of their graven image, and pray unto a God that cannot save. What we see here is that Israel, the escaped of the nations, is called upon to repudiate all idolatry. Gods made of wood and stone have no knowledge, so it is useless to pray to such gods. They simply cannot save. In verse 21, he says, declare ye and bring it forth. Yes, let them take counsel together. Who has showed this from ancient time? Who has declared it of old? Have not I, Jehovah? And there is no God else besides me, a just God and a Saviour. There is none besides me. 2 points are made here. First of all, Jehovah is the only revealer of events that have occurred in the past and events that are coming in the future. No idol can do that. And second, he is the only Savior. The gods of Babylon will not save the Jews. Only Jehovah will save the Jews. The God of Israel is just, and there is none besides him. So in verses 18 to 21, there was a message of salvation to Israel. But now in verses 22 to 25, there's a message of salvation to the Gentiles. In verse 22, look unto me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God, and there is none else. So now the God of Israel turns to the Gentile nations and called upon all nations to come and to look to the Lord. The Hebrew term here for look, it means to turn in the sense of putting one's faith in the Lord and being saved. To turn to the Lord to be saved. Now, what Jehovah had said to Israel, he also said to the Gentiles. That is that he alone is God, and there is none else. There is no other God. In verse 23, he says, there's a time coming when all Gentiles will be subjugated to God. By myself have I sworn, the word has gone forth from my mouth in righteousness, and shall not return, that unto me every knee shall bow, every tongue shall swear. So see, the Gentile nations have an option. The Gentiles can come to God now in faith and worship him now in faith and be saved. If they do not do that now in faith, they'll have to bow before him later in judgment, but there will be no salvation. He gives the Gentile nations an option. Look unto me now and be saved, or be forced to bow to me later in judgment. What's it to be? What God decreed in this verse will come to pass because he has sworn it by himself, and the word he spoke in righteousness will not return void. And then in verse 24, only in Jehovah is it said of me. It is said of me, is righteousness and strength. Even to him shall men come, and all they that were incensed against him shall be put to shame. So here, he spells out the coming judgment upon the rebellious among the Gentiles. Only in the God of Israel is righteousness and strength. Those Gentiles who were incensed against Jehovah will be shamed and will suffer the final judgment. As for Israel in verse 25, justification. She'll be declared righteous. In Jehovah shall all the seed of Israel be justified and shall glory. That's verse 25. All the seed of Israel, God's people, shall be justified and declared righteous in Jehovah, and in Israel shall be the glory, the Shekinah glory. Now this was the sixth major point of this section from Isaiah chapter 40 to 66. And that is, deliverance will come to Israel from Cyrus the Great. However, at the time, Cyrus will only bring physical deliverance. Cyrus is only a type of a far greater spiritual deliverance yet to come. Now we see from chapter 46 verse 1 down to chapter 47:15, we're going to see the judgment of Babylon and her idols. Now, throughout his prophecies, Isaiah has dealt periodically on the city of Babylon. Sometimes he has prophesied against the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar. Other times he has prophesied against the Babylon of the Antichrist that is yet to be rebuilt. This is the last section he'll spend upon Babylon. No more will Babylon be prophesied again after chapters 46 and 47. And in this instance, we're going to see now, he's dealing with the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II, which was where he reigned from about 605 BC to 562 BC, 605 to 562. Okay, we're going to look at the fall of Babylon, Babylonian idolatry in verses 1 to 12. And first up in verses 1 to 2, we're going to look at the captivity of Babylon's idols. And he singles out, God now singles out two key Babylonian gods. In verses 1 to 2, he picks on two of the key ones. It says, verse 1, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops. Their idols are upon the beasts and upon the cattle. The things that you carried about are made a load, a burden to the weary beast. They stoop, they bow down together. They could not deliver the burden, but themselves are gone into captivity. First, we see Bel. Now, Bel was the shortened form of Bel-Marduk. Bel-Marduk, oh, I didn't put it on the screen there. Bel-Marduk, B-E-L-M-A-R-D-U-K. Bel-Marduk eventually became Zeus in the Greek pantheon and Jupiter in the Roman pantheon. And this was a cult center of this god was Babylon. This cult center here was Babylon. The second one we see is Nebo, N-E-B-O. So we have B-E-L and Nebo. Nebo, he was a son of Bel-Marduk. His cult center was at Borsippa. That was near Babylon, and among his duties was traveling to Babylon to visit his father during New Year's festival. This is to visit his father, Bel-Marduk. Nebo was associated with the god Hermes by the Greeks, and Mercury by the Romans. But now these two are the most important gods of the Babylonian pantheon. They are now stooped low in the sense that they're lying in carts, bullock carts, to be carried away. Great gods that they were. They're nothing, he says, but heavy cargo for the beasts that bear them. And when these beasts grow tired of bearing them, these gods could give these beasts no strength to carry them any longer. Also, he says, Bel and Nebo could not deliver the burden. For these gods could not deliver Babylon from the invasion of Cyrus and the Persians. Instead, they themselves have now become the possession of Cyrus the Great. There's going to be a contrast in this and the next section, but notice in verses 1 to 2 that the gods of Babylon are gods that need to be carried about. That is his key point here. Having said this as the main point, in the rest of the chapter he makes three admonitions. The first admonition we see in verses 3 to 7. This is the contrast Jehovah with Babylonian idols. Now, in contrast to the gods of Babylon that need to be carried about in a bullock cart, the God of Israel is a God who carries. We see this in verses 3 to 4. Hearken unto me, O house of Jacob, and all the remnant of the house of Israel, that have been born by me from their birth, that have been carried from the womb. And even to old age I am he, and even to hoar hairs will I carry you. I have made, and I will bear. Yea, I will carry, and will deliver. So unlike the Babylonian gods that need to be carried about in a cart, Jehovah is the one who bears and carries the Jews from the cradle to old age. God is a bearer. The Babylonian gods need to be carried. The God of Israel is one who carries Israel throughout her past, present, and future history. And then in verses 5 to 7, Jehovah is a God who is incomparable. To whom will you like me and make me equal and compare me, that we may be like? Verse 6, such as lavish gold out of the bag and weigh silver in the balance. They hire a goldsmith and he makes it a god. They fall down, yes, they worship. They bear it upon the shoulder, they carry it and set it in its place, and it stands from its place till it not remove. Yea, one may cry unto it, yet can it not answer nor save him out of his trouble. So in verse 5, God challenges all to compare him with the Babylonian idols. In verse 6, all these other gods are man-made. Even if formed of precious metals, these idols were of no more value than gods made of wood and stone. In verse 7, all these other gods had to be born. They had to be carried and set in their place. By their own power they cannot move. They have been set. They remain there. Also, these other gods are unable to save anything. In his first admonition, Jehovah proves to be the victor. He challenges them to compare him with the gods of Babylon, and the distinction is a God who carries versus a God who must be carried. Second admonition is to remember the works of God in verse 8 to 11. Remember this and show yourselves men. Bring it again to mind, O ye transgressors. Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else. I am God and there is none like me. Declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure. Calling a ravenous bird from the east, a man of my counsel from a far country. Yes, I have spoken. I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed. I will also do it. So in verse 8, God challenges them to remember the things in the past. And then in verses 9 to 10, everything that has happened to Israel thus far was predicted beforehand by the Jewish prophets. Who was the revealer? Not the gods of Babylon, but it was the God of Israel. He alone revealed the former things. So they were written, so they were done. That is his point here. As the prophecies were written, so they will be fulfilled. And then in verse 11, Jehovah is not only the revealer of the things in the past, he's also the revealer of the things in the future. Verse 11 says, calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. Yes, I have spoken, I'll also bring it to pass. I have purposed, I'll also do it. So once again here it refers to Cyrus. Remember, Cyrus is a bird of prey from the east. We saw that back in chapter 41 verse 2. Chapter 41 verse 2. He will devour the nations that he will move against. As it is written, so it will be done. This is his point here. Now I prophesy things yet future, so as it is written, they'll come to pass, so it will be done. What I've prophesied will come to pass, God is saying. And we have the third admonition in verses 12 to 13. The third admonition is to respond to God's righteousness. Hearken unto me, you stout-hearted, that are far from righteousness. I bring near my righteousness, it shall not be far off. And my salvation shall not tarry. And I will place salvation in Zion for Israel my glory. So here in verse 12 is the call to the stout-hearted or stubborn-minded who were far from his righteousness. Now this is a divine description of the Babylonians. Jehovah declared that he would bring near his righteousness, the one that results in salvation. In verse 13, the righteousness is described. The righteousness of this one true God will result in salvation. Ultimately, God's righteousness will work out for the glory of his people Israel. Now, chapter 46 was the fall of Babylonian idolatry, and with this, the Lord now brings to an end his long war against the idols of Babylon. Now, in verses 1 to 15 of chapter 47, we see the fall of Babylon. So now he turns to the city itself. He declares the fall of Babylon to the Persians. This section is divided up into four divisions here. The first one is the declaration of the fall of Babylon in verses 1 to 5. Now, 5 points are made in these 5 verses. First, in verse 1, Babylon is going to go from throne to dust. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no more be called tender and delicate. Now, when the term daughter is used singularly, it refers to the population. When the term daughter is used in the plural, like daughters, it refers to the women. Here we see it singular, the daughter of the Chaldeans. It refers to the population of Babylon, the Chaldeans. It refers to them as a virgin daughter. Now, the high glory of the city of Babylon and the population of Babylon and the population of the Chaldeans that ruled the ancient world for a period of 70 years will now be leveled to dust. They'll no longer have the high throne of glory. No longer would Babylon be called tender and delicate. Second thing we see in verse 2, the daughter of the population of Babylon will now be reduced to doing menial tasks. They'll grind the meal. They'll cross the rivers for the purpose of harvest. It says in verse 2, take the millstones and grind meal. Remove your veil, strip off the train, uncover the leg, pass through the rivers. The picture here is that of a queen who has been reduced to a peasant, putting aside all modesty to wade through the waters. Third, we see in verse 3, the city itself will be violated. Your nakedness shall be uncovered. Yes, your shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance and will spare no man. Babylon's uncovered nakedness would bring shame. And the fourth thing we see in verse 4, our Redeemer, Jehovah of hosts, is his name, the Holy One of Israel. The city itself will be judged by Jehovah, the Redeemer and Holy One of Israel. And the fifth thing we see in verse 5, Babylon is now going to be demoted from her high glory. Verse 5 says, "Sit you silent and get you into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no more be called the mistress of kingdoms." The Chaldeans would sit in silence and darkness. The Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, whose hanging gardens were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, would no longer be called the mistress or queen of kingdoms. She's now reduced to dust. And this is where we're going to leave it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.